Welcome back, everyone, to the Risk Intel podcast, powered by SRA Watchtower, where we share risk intelligence with experts from across the banking industry. I'm your host, Ed Vincent, CEO at SRA Watchtower. Welcome back to the Risk Intel podcast. I'm extremely excited to have a returning guest and a new face on the program with us this week. Kirsten Muetzel, who is the founder of KLM Advisory and brings a varied background from public and private experiences. And I'll certainly ask folks to go back and listen to our recent episode where I share kind of Kirsten's full bio. But Kirsten, it's great to have you back on the program with us today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we have a new special guest here today with us for the first time. So please join me in welcoming Jeanette Quick. Jeanette, you similar to Kirsten have navigated a public market and a private market set of experiences, right? Working in the fintech arena at Gusto, and prior to that, working in the regulatory space, right, in the OCC, and working also in policy related roles within as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Financial Institutions Policy at Treasury. As well as having worked in the Senate Banking Committee and in the state of California, right, with the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. So extremely excited to have you with us here today as well, Jeanette. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. Kirsten, when we talked the last time, we were talking a bit about the topic of collaboration. And I think that really will be the theme that we'll dig into as a group here today. We talked about the importance of collaboration from a few different perspectives, from I'll say the bank and regulator relationships, but also from the bank and fintech partnership angles. So I'd like to start on the first side of this of really asking maybe the broader question of having worked across Wall Street and Silicon Valley and in DC. I'd love, Kirsten, your view on how banks, fintechs, and regulators could work together effectively to achieve their goals.
Yeah, so I feel pretty passionately about this topic because I've participated in all three roles, and that was why I really am so excited that Jeanette is here to join on this topic as well, because we both have different perspectives to share, and it's really fun when I sit in one role. So let's just say, when I'm an examiner at the Federal Reserve and engaging with banks, you hear all these things from banks that are frustrated with the examination process and with also the cross-agency examination process. If they have multiple bank charters and they've got the OCC and the FDIC and they've got the state and then also they may even have SEC and FINRA. So they get really frustrated, and they may or may not know in my case, they didn't know my background. But I very much understand each of the perspectives. So when you're the bank and you've got all of these different agencies coming in with different expectations, even when you're a small bank and you sometimes are held to standards that, in my opinion, shouldn't even be placed on your bank, right? If you're a small, non-complex institution with a fairly limited geographic footprint, there are sometimes examiners that come in that have exposure to other areas and impose the higher standards. And I'm specifically not using heightened standards since that's a particular term in supervision. But I have felt as a small bank that you can have expectations that seem outsized to what the risk profile of the bank is. Now, I've actually worked with banks where they are much more complex. They're small asset size, but they're very complex. And I feel that there should be more scrutiny of some of those banks and earlier in the process. So I've definitely felt from the bank's perspective, I've definitely been subject to pushback by banks as an examiner. And then really interesting, things have changed a lot over the 5 years that I've been in FinTech. And I would love to hear Jeanette's perspective on this too. But, you know, when I started off in FinTech, it was common to hear the phrase, we're not regulated. You know, we're not an MSB, a money services business. We're not an MTL, a money transmit, you know, we don't have a money transmission license. We're not subject to regulation. We're not a bank. And that just drove me nuts to hear. And today, 5 years later, if I hear that, you're going to hear, it's a triggering event for me. Because one, all companies are governed by the FTC. All corporations in the United States have are subject to things like, you know, monopolization. You know, so and I'm sure now Meta, formerly Facebook, is aware of that. But one of the things that I feel really passionate about is that the agencies should have some type of common framework for institutions that are engaging in innovation. I feel strongly that the banks should be very collaborative and transparent with their agencies that are providing the supervision, and that tech companies that are partnering with banks acknowledge that even if they're not a directly supervised institution, that they have an obligation, given their arrangement with a supervised institution, AKA a bank, that they are subject to those rules. And even, I just have one more thing. I will pause on this in a second, but you can see how passionate I am about this. One of the other things that I think has been lost in translation over the last few years is the evolution in the payments landscape in the United States in particular. I'm not talking globally, but just in the United States, how much has happened with technology companies becoming third-party service providers, and in some cases, third-party senders, and that often these technology companies are thinking about, if at all, thinking about regulation or supervision. They're thinking about, if at all, the FDIC. They're thinking about the FTC maybe, or the CFPB. That's still, as our last session, people will have to listen to that last session for my thoughts on I don't know what to think about the CFPB's future right now. But what they're not thinking about, and particularly in this payment space, some technology companies are not aware of the NACHA operating rules that apply to them. So that is, again, not a bank supervision agency, but it's another entity that has a close relationship, particularly with the Federal Reserve, given the Fed's rails with ACH and NACHA's governance role over ACH. So I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. Well, you shared a handful of themes there that Jeanette, I'm going to kind of push your direction here. And one of those themes is this concept that there is inherent, whether you want to call it conflict or discomfort, because you've got a number of different people, I'll say, on the other side of the table. Whether you're a fintech or you're a financial institution, you've got a whole host of different people that are coming in with different sets of demands and expectations. Jeanette, you've worn a number of those different hats, if you will, right, on that other side of the table, whether it's, policy or oversight, right, examination. I'm interested in that concept of consistency or inconsistency and commonality, and whether that is an impediment for collaboration, perhaps.
Yeah, great question. And I mean, I would echo a lot of what Kirsten said, which is that I think the collaboration amongst regulators and banks and fintech partners is really important. I mean, of course, there may be some inconsistencies in terms of, what agencies may be doing across agencies, right? If you're regulated by the FDIC, the OCC, the Fed, and possibly also state regulators, if you're talking about non-bank activity and sort of other activity that's regulated at the state level. Plus, Kirsten also mentioned a couple of securities regulators, right? There will be a patchwork and sort of multiple regulators that are coming in, who I think, generally, I think there is a sort of an aim to be consistent, that is shared by regulators, but it doesn't always happen. And also, there's different mandates. There's conflicting, sometimes missions or requirements, right? Or just overlapping requirements that may be slightly different from agency to agency. But I think that sort of trying to navigate all of those different regulations, and I think, being clear and open as a bank or as a fintech provider, in terms of where there may be differences in what you're dealing with from a compliance standpoint, and surfacing that to your regulator is actually really helpful, right? So I think that my overlying like theme in terms of recommendations or thoughts on that collaborative relationship is that banks and fintechs should really try to be proactive and sort of collaborate early and often, right? And I think when there are those conflicts, I think regulators actually do take that feedback very seriously and want to understand where, what they may be doing on the one hand may be different from, what their sister agency may be doing. I was at California DFPI during the Silicon Valley Bank failure. And one of the things that we did in our sort of postmortem was we talked a lot about the difference in supervision between the San Francisco Fed and the DFPI, right? Both have a mandate to examine and supervise the bank, and we both had, took part in exams on a regular basis, often coordinated, often joint exams. But there were different pieces were being looked at by different parts of these agencies, right? And so I think that there was some lessons learned there. There's I think always, I think the agencies are always in a position of trying to understand, what they're doing vis-a-vis other agencies. And I think it's helpful to hear feedback from banks about how that relationship's going, or if there are things that need to be worked on. So I definitely think that's important. And I think the other thing I would mention too is, it's helpful if, your regulators have heard about your plans or your business case, the products that you might be developing or the partnerships you're developing. I know over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of scrutiny, I think, of bank fintech partnerships, and related enforcement actions have come of those, right? And I think my sort of stance has always been like, if the first time you're really engaging with your regulator and talking to them about your product is at the time of enforcement, that's not a success, right? Like you should have been talking to them further, through the course of the relationship. And frankly, sometimes they may actually have a lot of really great feedback to tell you about, how they've seen these partnerships play out with other banks, or where they've seen things that may need to be worked on, that they can help give you feedback. And it's good to sort of invest in thinking through all the different angles ahead of time. And so the collaboration is extremely important.
Well, that last bit there, there's a number of different things, concepts that you introduced there, right? I think going back to my original question of consistency, right? Acknowledging that this is by design a patchwork environment, and patchwork not in a bad way, right? That is intentional. There are different things that are looked at by different people at different points in time, and acknowledging that's the scheme, that's the system, and that's okay. And so arrive with that expectation and expect that you're going to have different conversations. And I think, Janet, to your point, right, there is an objective of consistency, even if approaches are a little bit different. So that I think is an important message. I think that the concepts of being proactive, and I want to park that and come back to that, because I think that that's a particularly important one. But this last piece of engaging in a way and building a relationship there where you're sharing information and you're getting something in return. And so I'm interested in digging into this a little bit, because one of the challenges from a collaboration perspective is if you've got people at the table that are don't necessarily have the knowledge, the experience, the expertise, the understanding. but kind of part of that argument should be, well, that's why you have to be at the table. And so, right, you talked there, Jeanette, about the value of engaging that regulator early and getting feedback from them and getting reactions. I'm gonna take the perspective of, well, does the person on that other side of the table always bring that to the table? Do they bring that knowledge and understanding? And how does that then impact that collaboration?
Oh, can I jump? I think you're directing it to Jeanette, but I'm wanting to just jump in on this.
Go ahead.
Okay, so absolutely, sometimes what's happened, and I've been in the room when it's happened, as the person either representing the bank or working with the bank, in a room with an examiner that doesn't really understand the business model or the risks inherent or residual to the bank due to the business activity that's going on. And so I have tried to take certain approaches for the bank to prep for that, in that, one, you can kind of seed the board materials. So trying to train the examiners in advance of an exam by having board training, but then those training materials are available to the examiners. And then the other thing I try and do is have like a kickoff discussion with the examiners, where all the different examiners are at the table. Usually many of them are by video, but where you walk through what the business activity is, and then offering up the ability to follow up with their questions as one-offs. But that's all in the idea of this examination setting. There's a few other things I was writing down as you were talking, and one is the concept of the office hours. So I know some of the agencies have tried with office hours to engage with industry, so that the agency hears directly from, the boots on the ground and interacts and answers questions. One of the issues that I've seen with that approach from the bank perspective is that oftentimes the people that are running the supervision programs are not involved in the office hours program. So there's like a link that's missing between these conversations that are happening around innovation with progressive leaders within the organization, being, I don't want to name anyone in particular. So any one of the three bank supervision agencies, they might have office hours and innovation people, but there's somehow a loop that's missing back to the actual examiners on the ground, and that training for the examiners that are on the ground. So what I would say, in my experience, is not working is that that the bridge is missing, and that maybe there needs to be something there. But one other thing actually, there's two more things I want to talk about. So one is, I want to talk about open source communication. And I don't know if there's some way to do this, because what is happening is the agencies put out things like a request for information, and then all of the responses are public. There's no real-time open source collaboration between, that I know of, and maybe Jeanette or you, Ed, know of this, but and so correct me here, but I'm almost thinking, like, I want to be able to tell examiners how to conduct their exam of these types of banks, or to reach through to the FinTechs, because at this point, I pretty much understand how I would examine a FinTech, and I understand, because I've been working directly with the banks, how I would suggest to examine the banks. And I try to help during the examination process, but understandably, the examiners need to be extremely independent, and that's probably not the right place for me to be trying to help them. So I don't know if it's possible, but maybe someone's going to listen to this podcast and have an idea for this. But some type of open source collaboration where the industry can help the agencies to know where the real risks are at the banks from engaging in this. Okay, but we can pick up on that theme. One more thing I wanted to talk about, which is, in the spirit of this type of open source collaboration. I participate with Alloy Labs in their meetings in DC. Like in November, I went to DC with Alloy Labs, and we had forums with the agencies, with bank members, and did we have FinTechs? Now that I say that, I don't think we had FinTechs, but we at least had that interaction across the agencies and the banks. And then this summer, we're taking that one step further, and in July, we're having banks, tech providers, and we're going to have an open invitation for any of the examiners to be able to listen into this to help inform about infrastructure players, like tech players that are doing these, you know, third-party service provider type of activities with banks. So I'd say forums like that are my vision to how to help educate the agencies outside of the examination process. Okay, and I'm curious what Jeanette would think too.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, I mean, I think that to your question, Ed, I mean, I think that there may be an education gap, right? Sometimes with when you're talking to the regulator on the other side of the table. But I mean, I do want to give sort of some kudos, right, to regulators, especially being a former regulator, that there are a number of, most of them at this point have innovation offices, they have innovation staff, right? They've been working on those for I think like going on a decade, right? And that they have people that are sometimes from the industry, right, who have some experience. Like when I worked at California DFPI, I had directly come from 5 years at FinTechs, right? And so
Right.
I think that there has been a concerted effort to hire staff from FinTechs or from sort of the innovation economy. And I think there's been real attempts to try to understand how these partnerships work. That being said, I mean, there's nothing like being on the ground, building something internally. And so I do think it's helpful for, for tech, to fintech companies or banks that are coming in with a partnership to sort of, have an educational mindset, I think, as Kirsten mentioned, right? And have it, a spirit of collaboration and thinking about also these, opportunities to participate in forums to really share more information about how the products are structured or what, the partnership entails. Because I do think that there's not every partnership is exactly the same. There's going to be different characteristics of the sort of bank to begin with as well, right? Or composition of the bank's business. And it's important to sort of educate and walk through how the product works, go slowly, go through product flow, talk through what it means for the bank, how it impacts other parts of the bank, right? Like this is all very important stuff, I think, because it is, the education, I think, is really important there. And I mean, like I said too, there's, it's, a bank may approach us with, we have this product and what do you think about it? But the agency has the point of view of looking at thousands of different banks, right? They have in their mind, what we have almost 5,000 banks in the country. And so they may be comparing, what you're doing as a bank with your partnership to other, models that they have in their mind, right? And so I think, distinguishing what you may be doing is helpful, and sort of taking that education mindset, I think, is also very helpful, even though, there are some regulators that do understand, different models, but I think it's just making sure that they understand your model.
I think that those two bits there of recognizing that right, you as the financial institution or the fintech, you are always going to know more about your business. If you don't, then your business is probably not going to be successful, right? So accepting that, right, it is acknowledging that the person across the table brings something else, right? And your comment there, Jeanette, that they're looking at a wider swath, right? And so there is something different that they are bringing to the table, and reminding folks of that, and approaching with that mindset that yes, this is productive. There might be some education. There's also going to be some information sharing that goes both directions. So what would you say, Jeanette, are the biggest gaps to collaboration today, right? I think we've identified some of the ways that we could perhaps even overcome them. But like, could you put your finger on, right, what those gaps are?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd identify this as a gap per se, but I will say that I think that sometimes, in the past there has been like a fear of repercussions or fear of enforcement actions or sort of like a fear of what, the regulatory reaction might be. And so number one, I think that um, something important to think about, just to go back to what I said before, right, is that, I think the early engagement and education is super important. And I think also just understanding where we are in our current, I think, administration and life cycle of partnerships, right? So I know that, for example, Acting Chair Travis Hill at the FDIC, right, has recently flagged that one of their top priorities for the coming months is to be more open to innovation and technology, especially he mentioned fintech partnerships, right? So I think taking into account the current dynamics and current, I think, environment of openness to technology, I think should be helpful, I think, to folks that are thinking about, how to engage with regulators and sort of where to focus attention. So I don't think it was a gap before, but I do think that there may have been a perception of of sort of like that there was a negative perception of how these relationships might be considered. So I think just focusing on that education, and like I said, I want to be clear that um, that with the current administration's approach here, this is the fostering of innovation has been supported by multiple administrations, right? This has been something
Yeah.
that's been going on for many years. So this isn't necessarily a new thing, but it is important that that I think companies think about how to engage with regulators.
Right. So that gets into what do you do about it, and how do you approach this going forward? And so I think having that mindset, right, you characterize it, right, as early engagement and education, and I think earlier, right, you used the terminology of being clear and open, being proactive, engaging early and often, right? That mindset hopefully is one that you've cultivated previously, but now certainly is the time to lean into that, given the way the pendulum has swung in the current administration. Kirsten, how about you? I'll ask maybe a similar question to you. Could you put your finger on anything that is preventing better alignment between banks and regulators, and a recommendation for something that a financial institution could do differently to engage with regulators more effectively and to foster more collaboration?
I think there is a built-in difference of incentives for actually all three so I'm going to add back in those tech companies to the three.
Yeah.
So when I think about being inside of an agency, the incentive for me inside the agency, I happen to be motivated differently than, I think it's like 98% of the world's population. It's something like that. I can't remember exactly, but one of the tests that I took from a coach told me this, that I was doing it for public service. And when you're doing public service, the feeling that I had was to protect the financial system, to protect the consumers. And my goal was to prevent something bad from happening. When I work with a bank, I have to tweak my mindset, and my incentive is still, given the roles that I usually play within banks, it's to fix something, it's to make sure something bad doesn't happen to the bank, it's to be a chief risk officer or an audit executive. It's always in this mindset of helping the bank to prevent something going wrong that would hurt the bank. But banks are by design set up as for-profit institutions. So their motivation is going to be very different from people who are working in an examination setting. And the goal of the supervision function is different than the goal of a team, you know, CEO and president of the bank and whatnot at the bank. So I feel like first, to be able to have better collaboration, that is brought into the conversation. And it doesn't have to be explicitly brought in, but for every collaboration to be successful, you have to understand who the participants are. And I think for each of the people engaging in the conversation to engage with it at the front of their thought process, that by design, we have different motivating factors here. So how do we all ensure that we get, for the role that we're playing, we meet our goal? And then with that in mind, you can then be transparent about what those goals are and how to optimize. I'm not going to say maximize, but optimize, given those two very different goals from the different groups. So one of the things that I didn't talk about before with, you know, some of the ideas that I have are, there's the office hours and having this very explicit feedback loop to the supervision process. There's the open source, what I'm calling exam manual, where the industry can kind of help feed to the agencies rather than through a formal RFI process. It's kind of like a real-time ability to help scope out what the exam should look like of innovative banks. And then I talked about forums where you include all three different parties, tech companies, banks, and agencies in a non-examination setting and a non-formal setting. The thing I didn't mention before is what I've seen work for other, and this would be amazing to hear Jeanette's thoughts too, what I've seen work for other agencies in other countries. So I'll talk specifically about Singapore. I have consistently been impressed by the Singaporean approach to innovation, and what they have used and continue to use, as far as I know, is a regulatory sandbox. And there are ways for the supervisors to get firsthand knowledge of, and it's not just platforms for consumers to use, it's actual tools the supervisors could use, like ways to improve the supervision process, as well as ways to engage with new ideas that could be used with consumers. So I feel like we're still lacking that, and maybe it's just that I'm not super aware of it. Maybe it's somewhere in the agencies this is being discussed, but the concept that we have prided ourselves as a country on entrepreneurship, and the amount of you know, testing and failure happens so much in the US. It's a badge of honor in the United States. It is not a badge of honor to fail in a lot of other societies. But I think that's a virtue of our ability to have GDP, of our ability to innovate. But it's curious to me that we haven't tried that in the agency context. So I think one thing that I would love to see in the United States, in one of the bank supervision agencies, would be some type of a push into a regulatory sandbox, so that the agency personnel can better understand some of the products that are in use, and also that there's a bounded, like when things go wrong, that they go wrong within a small setting rather than an unbounded setting, for banks to try, for tech companies to try, for them to try it together. So that would be the last thing that I would talk about around the collaboration. And that might be a way for us to all pull together and work on something together.
Yeah, any reaction to that? Yes, any reaction to that whole regulatory sandbox concept?
Well, I know like sandbox has been sort of a loaded word for a while, and there's a lot of, I think, thoughts as to sort of why to have one or not. But I think without getting too much into that, I think with the sort of idea in mind that Kirsten is mentioning, which is, sort of how do you foster innovation while also making sure that that there are protections and that the safety and soundness of the financial institution or the system aren't compromised. I think that's an important consideration, right? And I think um, one of the things that came to mind when she was speaking was I think it's also helpful to think about some of these other sort of issue areas that have been of importance to regulators in the last several years. I'm thinking particularly of digital assets and AI, which were, of importance under the previous administration, but also under the current one. The president just announced a digital assets working group. I know that the OCC and FDIC both have put out information about sort of how they're thinking about digital assets. And then AI is also sort of, continues to emerge as a very hot topic. And so I think that there's space for thinking about how to thread the needle, right, on sort of the sandbox type question on balancing innovation and sound sort of regulatory and compliance goals. And then I think also weaving in thinking about, to the extent that you as a bank or financial institution or fintech are using some of these things like AI or experimenting with digital assets or sort of other creative payments mechanisms. I think those are sort of further ways to engage, right, with regulators. If you're saying like, hey, we're weighing in, we actually have thoughts on how we're using AI and how it feeds into this fintech or partnership or product that we're developing, they may sort of be interested in that product, not just from the supervisory examination context, but in the bigger context of what should they be doing on these questions, right? And then the other thing that came to mind was I guess just like a thought that it's incumbent on banks and fintechs to do their homework on what applies to them, right? And be very proactive in showing that you've done that homework. When Kirsten was mentioning earlier that it's sort of like a red flag or it immediately sort of sets a person off, especially in the regulatory world, when the fintech say, nothing applies to me, right? Or we're not regulated, because
Right.
immediately regulator's mind is going to start spinning into all the ways in which you either are regulated or could be regulated, or right, like there's all kinds of different things that could apply. So I think making sure that the fintech and the bank both understand the extent of possible authorities and sort of are proactive, right, about like, okay, we understand that we may be under the state money transmission law, but we're also, under banking laws as a partner of a bank, right? Like that's, and here's what it means for us and here's what we've done about it, I think goes a long way to show that you understand the regulatory environment and that you're a more credible resource and credible partner.
We've covered a lot of ground here. I am conscious of the time we've spent together, so I'm going to try and bring it to a close here. I think that last theme there, Jeanette, of doing your homework and coming prepared, I get that dovetails nicely with some of the earlier comments around, right, engaging early, being clear and open, being proactive. Kirsten, some of the ideas you mentioned around, right, I'll say very, very tangible actions that can be taken through open source communication, right? Sharing like open exam, right? Processes, forums where we bring people together, acknowledging that everyone doesn't arrive to the table with all the same experience and knowledge, but you're going to learn something from that other person across the table and have an educational mindset. I think, Jeanette, you used that term earlier. And then coming in and doing your homework. I think what I would say with all of these ideas is that I feel in this conversation that while each of you have acknowledged that there are opportunities for improvement, that there is some inherent optimism, I think, that has come through in this conversation, that generally speaking, people want to do the right thing and they want to engage productively. They want to collaborate. And so if you start with that mindset, look, you're not going to have a perfect outcome, but it certainly gives you a fighting chance, especially if you then incorporate some of these tools and techniques. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I would say I am aware that there are bad actors in the system. I would just say that I am not naive to believe that everyone wants to do the right thing. Unfortunately, I have a lot of books. You can't see them, but over here I've got like "You Can't Lie to Me" and "Snakes in Suits" and all sorts of things around, the lords of finance. I love these types of topics, and I read about when things go wrong. So I know that there are bad actors, but I would say that not everyone wants to be treated like a bad actor. And so, the big, maybe 96% of the time, I may be off, a little off on that stat, but 96% of the time people are good actors, and the banks are trying to do the right thing. The tech companies are just doing what they're motivated to do, which is to grow quickly and gain market share. So I think with that mindset, collaboration, let people prove that they're a good actor. And until they prove otherwise, engage in that collaborative, open dialogue to get as much information as possible, while remaining skeptical in the back of your mind.
Yes, Jeanette said it earlier, Jeanette, when you made the comment about fostering innovation, but also not compromising safety and soundness, and acknowledging, right, that you can approach this with a positive mindset, and being, right, appropriately skeptical and concerned. But I think if people do their homework, right, Kirsten, in your example, and they come well prepared, and the folks on the other side of the table have that perspective that they're ready to listen and they're ready to collaborate, you certainly get to the most productive outcome you're going to get to in that instance. Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you both being on here. Jeanette, quick, it was wonderful to have you on for the first time. Kirsten Muetzel, it was excellent to have you back. We appreciate the wide set of perspectives you brought to the conversation today, and I think that we can all end here with a belief that collaboration is important and inherently productive, and so we can all do our part to try and foster more of that going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.